The Vorhe said her body was a malfunction. They were wrong. It was a furnace, and we were freezing. I want to tell you about Anya Sokolova before I tell you what she did, because the doing makes no sense without the woman. She was 41 years old when the listening posts at Ceres went dark. A junior engineer on a research station nobody important had ever heard of, and she had a habit of humming through her teeth when she worked. She drank her tea so hot, it scalded the roof of her mouth, and she did it on purpose, she said, because cold tea reminded her of her grandmother's funeral, and she would not have that memory anywhere near her mourning. She kept a photograph of a dog in the breast pocket of her thermal suit. The dog had been dead for 9 years. She kept the photograph anyway. This is what you need to know about her. Not her clearance code. Not the rating of her reactor work. The dog, the tea, the way she hummed. The Vorhe came in winter, which is a thing we say now, even though there was no winter where we were. The Lagrange 2 station did not have weather. It had recycled air, and the white noise drone of the cooling vents, and the long blue cold of vacuum, pressing against the hull. And when the first Vorhe vessel slid out of the shadow of the moon, it was December on the calendar back home. And so we called it winter. Word stuck. Everyone needs a season for the thing that ends them. They did not announce themselves. They simply began to subtract. The relay at Tycho was the first, then the mining hab at Phobos, then the deep listen array beyond Pluto's orbit, gone in a clean, precise silence, as if a hand had closed over each light in turn. By the time the inner system understood what was happening, the Vorhe were already past Mars, and the United Earth Council was screaming into a radio fog that nobody on the other ends was listening to. They were not interested in our broadcasts. They were not interested in our flags or our anthems, or the diplomatic packets we fired at them in 73 languages. They had come for the rocks, and we were standing on the rocks, and that was the entirety of the conversation as far as they were concerned. Anya was on station L2 when the order to evacuate came down. She was 41 years old, and she was holding a wrench, and she remembered later that the wrench was warm in her hand from the friction of the bolt she had been turning, and that this warmth was the last warmth she would feel from a tool for a very long time. Sokolova, her supervisor said. His name was Mendez, and he had 3 children, and he never made it home. Sokolova, we are leaving. Get to lifeboat 7. I have not finished the coupling. Anya, we are leaving. She finished the coupling. She put the wrench in the rack. She put her hand on Mendez's shoulder when she passed him, and she said something in Russian that he did not understand, but that he later, in the lifeboat, asked another crewman to translate. The crewman told him she had said, "Ak, Solence, son." Mendez did not know what she had meant. He did not have time to ask. The Vorhe ship that took L2 took it with the slow patience of a man stepping on an ant, and Mendez and the crewman and 17 other people were in lifeboat 7 when it punched out of the station's belly, and Anya Sokolova was not. She was in the reactor room. She had stayed behind. This is where the official story stops. This is where the United Earth Council's bulletin says, "Zoomed lost with Station L2, posthumous service commendation, file closed." This is where the documentary footage cuts to a black card, with her name on it, and a date. This is where I tell you what actually happened, because I was there for the next part, and the part after that, and I have spent every year since trying to make people understand that what she did was not a sacrifice. A sacrifice is a thing you give up. Anya did not give anything up. She gave everything away, which is a different verb entirely, and the Vorhe, for all their patience and their geometry, and their 1,000-year war doctrine, did not have a word for it. The Vorhe are tall, taller than we are by a head and a half, and built along lines that suggest a creature that evolved in low gravity and high cold, all spine and elongation with skin, the color of wet slate and eyes set wide on the sides of a narrow skull. They do not have faces the way we have faces. They have surfaces. Their mouths are vertical seams that open along the underside of the jaw, and when they speak it is a clicking, layered sound, 3 or 4 tones at once. And the translation algorithms we built later said that every Vorhe sentence carries a meaning and a temperature, by which I mean that the same words at different vibrational pitches communicate not just what they mean, but how cold the speaker is, on the moral spectrum of the species A Voorhees sentence has a thermal value. Their philosophy is built around it. To speak warmly is to admit weakness. To speak at the absolute zero of their tonal range is to render judgment. When the Voorhees boarding party entered Station L2, they spoke very cold, indeed. There were 6 of them. They moved through the corridor with the unhurried confidence of surveyors. They were not soldiers exactly, the way we understand soldiers. They were closers. They had come to verify that the station was empty, to log the volume of recoverable ore in the cargo bays, and to schedule the demolition that would clear the structure for the harvesting platforms following behind them. They were not expecting resistance. They had not been told to expect anything but the empty hum of a vacated hab. What they found was a woman in a thermal suit sitting on the deck of the reactor room with her back against the primary containment shell, drinking tea. She had a thermos. She had taken it out of her locker on the way to the reactor, the locker where she also kept a spare pair of socks and a paperback novel, and the photograph of the dog, and she had filled the thermos from the galley unit, before the galley unit's power was rerouted, and now she was sitting on the deck plate with her gloves off, and her hands wrapped around a steel cup of tea so hot that the steam coiled up through cold air of the depressurizing station like a small private weather system. The lead Voorhees stopped in the doorway, its head tilted on its long stem of neck. Its mouth seam parted and it spoke, and the tones it used were the tones one uses for a piece of equipment that has unexpectedly produced a sound. Designate, it said, in its layered click. The translation we have for that is, identify yourself. But the temperature of the word was wrong. It was not curious. It was the tone you use when you ask a malfunctioning toaster why it has spoken to you. Anya did not look up. She blew across the surface of her tea. You're tall, she said in Russian, and then she switched to English, because her English was better than her common tongue, and she wanted to be understood. You should sit down. The deck plates retain heat for a while. You'll lose your fingers if you keep standing. The Voorhees did not sit down. The Voorhees did not have a concept that mapped neatly to sitting down. But it did not shoot her either, which is, in retrospect, the single most important sentence in this entire war, and which I will come back to. It did not shoot her because she was not, by any reading of Voorhees doctrine, a threat. She was an anomaly. She was an empty station with a woman in it, and that was a category their war manuals did not contain, and so they were obligated to log it before they erased it. Designate, the Voorhees said again, and the temperature dropped a quarter of a tone. Anya Sokolova, she said. Engineer, 2nd class. Lagrange 2 station. I am freezing my ass off because you turned off my heat. Do you want some tea? She held up the thermos. There is a recording of this moment. The Voorhees record everything. They are obsessive archivists, and when we eventually recovered the data cores from the station after the war, everything, we found this exchange logged in 8 separate streams: visual, auditory, thermal, electromagnetic, atmospheric, and 3 I do not have the science to explain. You can watch it. The Voorhees is centered in the frame. Anya is at the lower left, small bundle of insulation and steam. She is offering a thermos to a creature 7.5 feet tall that has just helped sterilize half a solar system, and she is doing it the way you would offer a drink to a tired plumber who has come to fix your sink. The Voorhees tilted its head the other way. This vessel is scheduled for material reclamation in 11 minutes, it said. That's not very long. Anya said. T? You are not on the manifest. I'm not on a lot of manifests, T? The Voorhees behind the lead one shifted. Their weapons were not drawn, exactly. But they were carried in the loose grip posture that the Voorhees use when they are processing an unknown variable. One of them spoke in their own tongue very fast, and the lead Voorhees answered, slower, with a temperature that had risen by perhaps 1/8 of a tone. They were uncertain. They were genuinely uncertain, and this was a thing the Voorhees did not enjoy being. Anya, very calmly, poured a second cup of tea. She poured it into the thermos lid she had unscrewed and set on the deck beside her, and she filled it just past halfway, the way her grandmother had taught her. Never to the brim, Devochka. You want them to come back for more? Cheat. She set the cup down on the deck plate about 3 feet in front of her, in the empty space between herself and the boarding party, and she pulled her hand back and she went back to her own cup. The steam from the second cup rose between them. "It is cold in here," Anya said, conversationally. "I am sorry about that. The boiler core is on the level below us, and I cannot keep it running with only myself to feed it. But the deck plates will hold heat for about another 20 minutes. The tea is hot. You are welcome to it." The lead Vorhe looked at the cup. I have watched this recording 46 times. I have watched the lead Vorhe look at the cup, and I have watched the long pause that followed. And I will tell you with absolute certainty that what happened in that pause was not what the Vorhe thought was happening. They thought they were processing a tactical anomaly. They thought they were logging a non-standard behavior pattern from a stranded biological. They were wrong. What was happening in that pause was that Anya Sokolova, engineer second class, 41 years old, was conducting first contact, and she was conducting it the way her grandmother had taught her, which was with a hot drink and a place to sit, and the absolute refusal to be hurried. The Vorhe did not drink the tea, they could not have drunk it. Their biology does not process hot liquid. The heat would have shocked their throat membranes. But the lead Vorhe did something else. Something that nobody on our side of the line understood at the time. And that took us 3 years and 40 linguists to parse. It lowered its weapon a fraction of a degree. In Vorhe body language, this is not a gesture of peace. We thought it was for a long time. We were wrong about that too. In Vorhe body language, lowering the weapon by that exact angle is a gesture of acknowledgement of category error. It means, you are not what I expected you to be, and until I have recategorized you, my prior intentions are suspended. It is, in their entire war doctrine, the single hardest gesture to provoke. Anya, who did not know any of this, who was simply a woman drinking tea on a dying station, smiled at the Vorhe. She had a chipped front tooth from a hockey game when she was 13. She had never gotten it fixed, because she said it made her look like she had a sense of humor. She smiled at the 7-foot-tall, slate-skinned closer, and the chipped tooth caught the emergency lights, and she said, "My grandmother used to say that a guest who refuses tea has not yet decided whether to be a guest." Have you decided? The Vorhe did not answer. The Vorhe could not answer, because, in the language of its own people, in the layered click, and the careful temperature of its native tongue, there was no word for guest, the way Anya had used it. There was a word for visitor, afford, occupant, a word for trespasser. But the thing Anya had offered, the conditional welcome of guest, was not in the vocabulary. The lead Vorhe spoke into its throat comm. It spoke for a long time. The other 5 Vorhe stood in the doorway of the reactor room and did not move. Outside in the cold corridors of the station, the demolition charges were being placed by a second team that did not know what was happening here. Above them, in orbit, the Vorhe cruiser was already calculating the trajectory that would push Station L2 into the corrected disposal orbit. 11 minutes, then 10, then 9. Anya drank her tea. She had not, you understand, planned any of this. She had stayed behind for a much simpler reason. She had stayed behind because the reactor coupling she had been working on, the one she had not finished, when Mendez had called her to the lifeboat, was a coupling she alone on the station knew how to seat correctly. It was a temperamental piece of work. It was older than she was. It required a specific sequence of half-turns and a hand pressure that you developed only over years. And if it was not seated correctly when the demolition charge fired, the reactor would not detonate cleanly. It would vent. It would vent in a slow asymmetric cascade that would send a plume of radioactive coolant across 500,000 cubic kilometers of orbital space, and into the path of the 3 civilian convoys that were, at that moment, running for the safety of the inner system. Anya had done the math in her head, while Mendez was shouting at her about Lifeboat 7. The convoys were 16 hours out. The coolant plume would reach them in 11. She had stayed behind because the alternative was 3,000 civilians, dying slowly in their own ships, and Anya Sokolova had not been built, by whatever combination of mother and grandmother and chipped tooth and dead dog, to allow that. She had thought briefly about leaving anyway. She wants me to tell you that. There is a recording of her last private log entry, made in the locker room before she walked back to the reactor. And in the recording she sits on the bench with her thermos in her lap, and she says, in a very calm voice, "I am 41 years old, and I would like to live to be 80. I would like to see what my knees feel like at 60. I would like to read the 7 books in the series I have been reading. I would like to find out whether the woman in apartment 14, on Mark's Prospect, was ever going to ask me to dinner the way she kept almost doing. I am telling the record this because I want the record to know I am not a saint. I am a woman who is afraid and who would like to live. I am staying because the math does not allow me to leave. That is all. That is the only reason. I am not brave. I am bad at arithmetic in any direction that makes me feel better." The log entry is 63 seconds long. She does not cry in it. She hums for a moment the same 4 notes she always hummed when she worked, and then she stands up, and she picks up her thermos and she walks out of frame, and the camera, set to motion trigger, clicks off. Is a thing the Vorhei do not have, and I want you to understand it before I go on, because the absence of this thing is the shape of the door Anya walked through. The Vorhei do not have a tradition of strangers. Their civilization, all of it, every habitation across the 11 worlds they have settled, is constructed on the model of the hearth circle, which is the formal kinship grouping a Vorhei is born into and dies inside of. Every Vorhei knows, from the day its mouth seam first parts, who its veshmates are and who they are not, and the protocols of interaction are entirely determined by this knowledge. You do not greet a non-vesh. You do not feed a non-vesh. You do not, under any circumstances, share temperature with a non-mesh, because temperature, in their philosophy, is a thing transferred only between bound beings. A Vorhei cannot enter the home of another Vorhei without ritual permission. A Vorhei cannot offer water to another Vorhei without invoking the Seth formula, a clicking sequence of obligations that binds the giver and the receiver into a temporary auxiliary, vesh, that may last hours or years depending on the gravity of the gift. When the Vorhei went to war against the 19 species they had previously erased, they did it cleanly because, by their own grammar, none of those species were vesh. They were not non-vesh either, because non-vesh is a relational category and presumes that some prior recognition has occurred. The species they erased were outside the grammar. They were objects in the way of resources. There was no moral apparatus that required engagement, because the moral apparatus presumed kinship as the precondition of recognition, and these species had no kinship to claim. This is the doctrine the lead closer carried into the doorway of the reactor room on station L2. This is the doctrine that told the closer that the small figure on the deck plate was an object, not a being. This is the doctrine that should have ended the conversation in 3 seconds with a single weapon discharge and a brief notation in the closing log. What the doctrine did not have a clause for was a being that recognizes you before you recognize it. Did not have a clause for a small but slundle installations on the deck plate who looks up at you with a tooth and offers you her temperature, who pours hot liquid into a cup and sets the cup in the empty space between, performs the Seth formula in a language she has never heard. With gestures she does not know are gestures. Using a body she does not know is speaking. The doctrine had no clause for this because the doctrine assumed that recognition flowed in one direction, from the Vorhei outward, and that the outward thing being recognized had no capacity to recognize back. Anya did not know she was performing the Seth formula. She did not know that pouring tea into a second cup and setting it down in the empty space was, in the most ancient Vorhei kinship rite, the precise gesture by which a hearth mother welcomes a wandering veshed back from a long absence. She did not know that the words, "Do you want some tea?" mapped in the cadence of her offering and the angle of her body and the temperature of her voice to the opening line of a poem the Vorhei recite at funerals for kin lost in cold weather. She did not know any of this. She could not have known it. The translation algorithms that would later parse the recording did not yet exist. The linguists who would later parse the algorithms had not yet been born to the discipline. She was a 41-year-old engineer with 7 minutes to live, and a thermos full of tea, And she was performing, by accident, by the simple inheritance of her grandmother's manners. The most sacred welcoming rite in an alien civilization 11,000 years old. The lead closer saw it. The lead closer could not unsee it. The lead closer's mouth seam parted and closed and parted again. The small involuntary motion that in Voorhees body language indicates the processing of a categorical impossibility. Somewhere in the long chain of computation that runs through a Voorhees skull on its narrow stem of neck, a circuit closed that had not closed in the closer's entire professional life. The being on the deck plate was Vesh. The being on the deck plate had welcomed it home. She had seated the coupling. She had finished the work. The reactor would now detonate as designed. Clean, fast pulse that would scatter only inert metal and a brief radio shadow, and the convoys would pass through the wash with their hull plating intact, and 3,000 people would live. The tea was incidental. The tea was what you did after. When you had 9 minutes left, and you were 41 years old, and you did not want to die thirsty. But the tea was what the Voorhees saw. The lead Voorhees finished its throat-calm conversation. It turned its narrow head back toward Anya. The other 5 had not moved. The cup of tea on the deck plate was still steaming, though more weakly now, the heat bleeding away into the cold air of the dying station. "You are not afraid," the Voorhees said. It was not a question. The temperature of the words had risen another eighth of a tone, and the translation note, when we eventually parsed it, said that this was the temperature of a Voorhees, admitting confusion to a subordinate. It was an enormous concession. It was the kind of concession that, in the Voorhees military hierarchy, costs you status. "I am very afraid," Anya said. "I have been afraid for an hour. But the tea is hot and the deck is warm and you have not shot me. And a person can be afraid and still drink her tea. My grandmother taught me this also." "Your grandmother." The Voorhees rolled the word in its throat. It was not a word it had translation for. It was a phonetic approximation. Babushka, which Anya had said in Russian and which the algorithm had not converted. "What is Pushka?" "The woman who taught my mother how to be a person. She is dead. She was a small woman. She was very angry at the world, and very kind to her family, and she made tea like this, and she said that the only way to know if a stranger was a friend was to give him a hot cup and see what he did with it." The Voorhees looked at the cup on the deck. "I cannot drink your liquid," it said. "It would burn my throat." "I know. Then why have you offered it?" Anya considered this for a moment. She looked up at the long slate face and the wide-set eyes, and she said, "Because the offer is the thing, not the drinking. The offer is what tells you who I am. You can keep the cup. You can take it with you. It is yours now. I have given it to you." In Voorhees military doctrine, a gift is an impossibility. They have words for tribute and for trade and for spoils. They do not have a word for unconditional transfer of value. Close concept in their language is the loss of an object due to combat error. To give a thing freely, with no expectation of return, with no transaction implied, is in their cosmology a category error of the deepest kind. It is the kind of error that in their philosophical texts is associated only with malfunctioning machinery or with the mad. The lead Voorhees stood in the doorway of the reactor room and looked at the cup of cooling tea and tried to understand what had just been done to it. 7 minutes, then 6. "You will die in this room," the Voorhees said. "Yes. You knew this when you stayed." "Yes." "Why?" Anya put her own cup down on the deck. She unzipped the breast pocket of her thermal suit. She took out the photograph of the dog. It was a small photograph. Creased at the corners, the colors faded toward green. She looked at it for a moment. Then she leaned forward, and she set the photograph next to the cup of tea, in the empty space between herself and the boarding party, and she pulled her hand back. "This was my dog," she said. "His name was Tumen. It means fog. He died 9 years ago. He was very stupid, and he was very loud, and he loved me without any conditions whatsoever. And I have carried his picture in my pocket every day since, because a person should carry something that loved them. I am giving him to you also. You can keep him. He is yours now." The Voorhees did not move. "I do not want him to be alone in the cold when the reactor goes," Anya said. "I want him to be with someone. Someone who is going to walk out of this room alive." "Will you walk out alive, Voorhees?" "Yes." Then take the photograph, please. 6 minutes. Then 5. The lead Vorhe did something then that no Vorhe had done. That no Vorhe would do again for 2 years and 4 months. And that we did not understand the meaning of until very late in the war. It bent. It bent its long body down from the waist. Slowly the way a crane lowers its arm. And it reached out one of its 3 fingered hands. And it picked up the photograph of the dog called Tuman. And it held the photograph very carefully between 2 of its fingers. And it straightened back up. It did not take the cup of tea. Tea was already cooling. It took the dog. And then it said, in the lowest temperature of its language, temperature, reserved for the most formal of declarations, the temperature that in Vorhe culture is used only at funerals and at the swearing of oaths. I have received your gift. Anya smiled. The chipped tooth caught the light again. Good, she said. Then go. Go quickly. Friends are waiting. The Vorhe stepped backward out of the doorway. The other 5 stepped back with it. The lead Vorhe held the photograph in its hand and it did not put it away, did not file it, did not log it. It held it the way you would hold a small bird. They retreated down the corridor, and they boarded their shuttle, and they decoupled from Station L2, and 4 minutes later the demolition charges fired. And the reactor detonated cleanly, and Anya Sokolova, engineer second class, 41 years old, ceased to exist in any form that the universe could subsequently locate. The 3 convoys passed through the wash with their hull plating intact. 3,000 people lived. And on the bridge of the Vorhe cruiser, the lead closer, whose name in our records is rendered as Veshtul Kara, but which actually means something closer to the one who counts the empty rooms, stood in front of its commanding officer and made its report. And at the end of the report it produced the photograph of the dog, called Tuman, and it placed the photograph on the bridge's central console. And it said, in the formal temperature, that it had received a gift from a creature that should not have been able to give one, and that this gift required the suspension of category protocol, and that it requested a review of the species designation. The commanding officer looked at the photograph. The commanding officer was, in the Vorhe hierarchy, a creature of considerable rank. It had counted empty rooms across 19 species, and it had never once been asked to suspend category protocol. It looked at the photograph of a small dead dog from a small dead planet, and it tilted its narrow head, and it said something that did not translate cleanly, but that the algorithms eventually rendered as, she fed her enemy in the cold. This is, in Vorhe moral grammar, the highest possible thing one creature can say about another. It is the description applied, in their oldest legends, to the founder figures of their own civilization. It is not a compliment, it is a classification. To feed your enemy in the cold is to demonstrate the property the Vorhe call Sethivora. Translates roughly as the warmth that does not need to be returned, and which in their entire philosophy is the marker of a species that has achieved moral personhood. The Vorhe had not classified another species as having achieved moral personhood in 11,000 years. They paused the war. They did not announce it. They did not send us a message. They simply stopped advancing. The harvesting platforms that had been following the closers fell behind and then fell still. The cruisers in the outer system held position. The slow, patient subtraction of the human presence in space simply ceased. And for 31 days nobody on Earth understood why. Then the photograph came back. It came back in a small unmanned probe that decelerated outside the Lagrange 1 station and broadcast, in 73 languages, a request for the next of kin of Anya Sokolova, engineer second class, late of Station L2. Probe was opened by a very confused communications officer. Inside the probe was the photograph of the dog called Tuman, and a second object, a small flat disc of slate-colored material that when finally decoded 8 months later, contained a single line of Vorhe script. The script read, in the formal temperature, the gift has been kept. The cold has been understood. The room is no longer empty. We did not understand it. We did not understand it for a very long time. We assumed it was a feint, a trick, a prelude to some new horror. We readied our defenses, and we held our breath, and we waited for the war to resume, and the war did not resume. Instead, 4 months later, the Vorhe sent an envoy. The envoy was a tall, slate-skinned closer with wide-set eyes and a vertical mouth seam, and it landed at the United Earth diplomatic compound in Geneva on a clear, cold morning in March. And the first thing it did, before any other action, before any greeting or any protocol or any negotiation, was to walk to the small fountain in the courtyard and to bend down and to dip the fingers of three-fingered hand into the water, and to bring the wet hand to its forehead, in a gesture that we did not recognize at the time, but that the Vorhei texts later confirmed was the gesture of a guest house. The envoy was the lead closer from Station L2. It had asked specifically to be the first to make contact. It had cited as its qualification the fact that it had received a gift. In its long, elegant hand, when it walked through the doors of the diplomatic compound, it carried a small framed photograph. The frame was Vorhei work, slate gray, very simple. The photograph inside the frame had been carefully restored. The creases smoothed. The colors brought back as close to their original tones as their conservators could manage. It was a photograph of a small, loud, stupid dog named Tumen who had died 9 years before the war, and who had loved his person without any conditions whatsoever, and who was now, in a manner Anya Sokolova could not have predicted but might possibly have approved of, the most famous dog in 2 civilizations. The envoy set the photograph on the table at the first negotiation. It did not file the photograph as a credential. It did not present it as a token. It simply placed it there, in the empty space between itself and the human delegates. And it said, in the layered click of its own language, and in the formal temperature reserved for the swearing of oaths, I have received a gift. I have come to return one. The treaty took 6 years to write. The treaty has held for 22. There are statues of Anya Sokolova now. There is one in Geneva and one in Moscow and one in the rebuilt foyer of Station L2, which the Vorhei rebuilt themselves at their own expense as a condition of the treaty's 7th clause. The statue in the L2 foyer is not large. It is a small bronze figure of a woman sitting on a deck plate with a thermos in one hand. The chipped tooth is rendered with great care. The Vorhei sculptors insisted on the chipped tooth. They said, through their translators, that the chipped tooth was the part of the face that had been smiling, and that the smile was the part that had received the gift. I have stood in front of that statue. I was 19 years old when the war ended, and I was 36 when the rebuilt station opened. And I went up there on a slow shuttle and I stood in the foyer, and I looked at the small bronze woman with her chipped tooth, and I tried to find words for what I felt, and I could not. I am a soldier. I was a soldier anyway, before the war ended and there was no more soldiering to do. I had killed Vorhei. I had been very good at killing Vorhei. I had been on the Tycho relay when it fell, and I had been one of 7 people who walked off that station alive. And I had carried the memory of the friends I left behind into every engagement after. And I had used that memory the way you use a knife. I had been, in my way, the opposite of Anya Sokolova. I had been a person who hardened. She had been a person who warmed, and the warming had won the war. Not the hardening. The warming. I want you to understand what I am telling you, because I think it gets lost sometimes in the official version. The official version is that humanity stood firm in the face of impossible odds, and that the Vorhei, recognizing our resolve, withdrew. The official version is a clean story about courage and steel and the indomitable spirit of our species. And the official version has been printed on 100 memorial plaques and read at 1,000 ceremonies. And the official version is not entirely wrong, but it is also not what happened. What happened is that a woman drank tea on a dying station. What happened is that she offered a cup to a creature that had come to kill her, and that the offering was so completely outside the categories of the creature's experience that the creature was obligated, by the protocols of its own civilization, to suspend the killing long enough to think about what had just been done. And in the thinking, creature realized something that the Vorhei had not realized about any other species in 11,000 years, which was that warmth offered without expectation of return is not weakness. It is the opposite of weakness. It is the assertion of a self so complete that it does not require defending. It is the act of a creature that has decided who it is, and that will be that creature. And will be that creature in the cold, and will be that creature in the dark, and will be that creature on the deck of a dying station, with 7 minutes left to live, and a tall, slate-skinned stranger standing in the doorway, with a weapon. The Vorhe call this Sci-Fi. The warmth that does not need to be returned. We do not have a single word for it. We have instead a name. We have Anya. We have the chipped tooth and the thermos and the photograph of a dog called Fog. We have a 41-year-old engineer second class who hummed through her teeth when she worked and who drank her tea too hot because cold tea reminded her of her grandmother's funeral, and who, given the choice between living and feeding her enemy in the cold, chose to feed her enemy in the cold, and in choosing so, ended a war that had not yet finished beginning. The Vorhe envoy comes back to L2 station once a year. It is older now. Its slate skin has darkened toward black, which is what happens to Vorhe in age. And its wide-set eyes have clouded slightly at the edges, and it walks with the slow, careful gait of a tall creature that has begun to feel its height. It comes alone. It does not speak to the press. Throxfoss to the small bronze statue, and it stops in front of the statue, and it bends from the waist. The long, slow bend of a crane lowering its arm, and it sets a small object on the deck plate in front of it. The object is a cup. It is a small handmade cup, slate gray, very simple, and it is always, when the envoy sets it down, full of a clear hot liquid that the Vorhe do not drink and never have. The steam rises off the cup and curls up through the cold air of the foyer in a small private weather system, and the envoy stands in front of the statue with the chipped tooth and the thermos. And it does not speak, and it does not move, and after a long time it straightens back up, and it turns, and it walks back to its shuttle, and it leaves. The cup stays. Cleaning crew has standing orders not to remove it. They are to let it cool. They are to let it cool overnight, and then to wash the cup and set it back beside the statue, empty, until the envoy returns the next year with a fresh one. The cup is always empty by morning. Nobody has ever seen who drinks it. The cleaning crew has theories. They are romantic theories, for the most part, and I will not repeat them here, because Anya, I think, would have laughed at them. The way she laughed at everything sentimental, with the chipped tooth showing, and the eyes crinkling at the corners. But I will tell you what I think. I think the cup is empty because the gift was received. I think the cup is empty because Sci-Fi is not a one-way transaction. It is a circuit, a loop, a returning thing, and the Vorhe envoy comes back every year not to pay tribute but to complete the circuit. To close the loop that Afyala Sokolova opened on a dying station, in the cold with her hand around a thermos, and her tooth catching the light. I think the cup is empty because something is still drinking it. Not Anya, not literally, but the thing she was, the thing she made of herself in the last 7 minutes of her life, the warmth she gave to a stranger who had come to end her. That thing is still drinking. That thing has been drinking for 22 years, and it will keep drinking for as long as there are tall slate-skinned envoys willing to bend from the waist and set a steaming cup on a deck plate in front of a small bronze statue with a chipped tooth. I want you to remember this when people tell you what humanity is. When they tell you we are warriors. When they tell you we are clever. When they tell you we are resilient and adaptable and dangerous. When they show you the footage of the engagements at Tycho and Phobos and the long, bloody year before the Vorhe withdrew. When they make speeches about the indomitable spirit and the unyielding will. I want you to remember that. The war did not end because of any of that. The war ended because a woman who was about to die offered a cup of tea to the creature that was about to kill her. The war ended because she meant it. The war ended because Sci-Fi is a property the Vorhe did not believe could exist outside their own legends, and Anya Sokolova, engineer second class, 41 years old, demonstrated it on a deck plate with 9 minutes left on the clock, and the demonstration was so complete and so unhurried and so absolutely without performance that the Vorhe, looking at it across the cold air of the reactor room, recognized in our species something they had not recognized in the 19 species they had previously erased. They recognized a people who could be warm in the cold. That is what we are. That is, in the final accounting, what we have always been. We are the species that warms its hands on a cup and offers the cup to a stranger. We are the species that hums through its teeth while it works. Shh. We are the species that carries the photograph of a dead dog in its breast pocket for 9 years. Because a person should carry something that loved them. We are not the indomitable, we are the warm. And when the cold came for us, when the tall, slate-skinned closers slid out of the shadow of the moon and began the slow, patient subtraction of our lights, we did not, in the end, defeat them. We did something rarer and stranger and more difficult. We invited them in. We gave them a cup. We gave them a dog. Fed our enemy in the cold, like the sun does. Like the sun has always done. Without asking, without expectation, without any condition whatsoever. The cup on the deck plate in front of the small bronze statue is always empty by morning. I hope, wherever she is, that she knows this. I hope she knows that the chipped tooth caught the light, and the light kept going, and the light is still going. And somewhere in the long, cold dark between the stars, there is a tall, slate-skinned creature who walks slower than it used to, and who carries, in the inner pocket of its formal robe, a small framed photograph of a dog named Fog. I hope she knows that. Bank babushka is now a word in the Vorhe language. They had to invent it. They invented it for her. I hope she knows that the room is no longer empty. I hope. When she sat on that deck plate in those last minutes with her hand around the warming steel of the thermos, with the steam curling up between herself and the tall stranger in the doorway, chipped tooth showing and the photograph of Tumen still in her breast pocket. I hope, in that moment, with 7 minutes left and the reactor humming below her and the cold air thickening around her, she understood somehow what she had just done. She felt the warmth come back. 'Cause it did. It came back. It is coming back still. Every year, in a small bronze foyer on a rebuilt station at Lagrange 2, a cup is set down and a cup is emptied, and the circuit closes, and the warmth completes itself, and somewhere in the long dark between her and the rest of us, Anya Sokolova, engineer second class, 41 years old, drinks her tea. She drinks it too hot. She always did.